is they just don't know what politicians have done. So this is one of the things we did. We did a baseline and end-line survey with about 2,000 citizens in Malawi around the schools we're working with, and asked them, among other things, whether they know anything that councillors have done for their community. And what you find is basically no one knows anything that councillors do for their community, and the teachers do about twice as good as citizens, which suggests, if this is kind of maybe a lower bound of what councillors actually do, citizens know about half of what councillors are actually doing. They know even less if we think about other schools. People don't know anything about what is going on in other schools in Malawi. So how do we solve this problem? Basically what we're going to do is we're going to work with a partner around an actual real aid project. We're going to go to politicians directly. So rather than just looking at outcomes, we're going to go to politicians directly and ask them to make a decision about where a project should go. That's going to be a constrained decision that we can measure, we can use to measure outcomes. So this is a real and costly decision environment, and then we're going to experimentally assign transparency to these decisions, and I'll explain what that means. And we think that the results are interesting and potentially give us some interesting policy implications because they tell us that the intervention that we're doing is a relatively straightforward, cheap intervention. We're not going and massively reforming the politics of Malawi here, and yet we're still seeing fairly strong effects on how these decisions are made. So the context we're working in here is with local councillors in Malawi. So these were councillors that were elected in 2014, so for the first time. So these are fairly new councillors, which is important to note. One of the things that's important here is we're going to set this up in terms of an aid project. So basically our partner NGO is going to these politicians and asking them to make a decision about where aid should go. This is a very common decision that politicians are making in much of the developing world, but specifically in Malawi. Malawi is one of the most aid-dependent countries in the world. About 36% of their budget is funded by donors. A lot more local public service provision is funded by donors. And politicians, this is a survey we did with politicians post-treatment, and basically these politicians are interacting with donors and NGO on a weekly, daily, or monthly basis, almost universally. Okay, so I'm going to talk through a little bit our theory about how we think distributional politics works in Malawi and what effect transparency has, and then I'll get into our experimental instrument and results. So if we think about the typical distributional problem that a politician faces, the usual way we think about this is in terms of some utility function for voters, right? Where voters care about what they're getting individually, they're getting a water point in their village. They also care about the kind of programmatic spillover effects, right? They care about the fact that you're spending money on a place that actually needs it, which is potentially having spillover effects on growth and showing something about your effectiveness as a politician. And then we think about voting for an incumbent in a kind of retrospective voting framework if you're a political scientist, that voters consider whether or not this utility they're getting in terms of transfers from a politician exceeds some disutility voting for an incumbent, right? So if it's an opposition incumbent, you're required to pay them more. If it's an incumbent you like, then you're required to pay them less. So then incumbents are just optimizing over this problem and distributing appropriately. Now the question that we're trying to face is what happens when there's some uncertainty about the public good spillovers, right? Whether the good is being spent effectively, and whether or not you know the full size of the budget, right? Whether or not that project you got in your village represents a large portion or a small portion of the total budget. We think that there's at least a couple ways that transparency changes this problem. One is if voters, and we're going to include stakeholders here as well, because it's not just voters that are holding politicians accountable. If voters know the distribution of goods, they should be more capable of rewarding incumbents for welfare improving allocation decisions, right? So if we look at focus group data that we did among voters, we find that voters care a lot about whether or not politicians are spending places that effectively. We think if we tell people where projects are going, that they should be more capable of rewarding politicians for doing this kind of effective aid allocation. Additionally, and here we separate a little bit from the kind of standard models, is we think that voters may actually punish politicians for engaging in very politicized allocation, right? If a politician is spending money in, in a place where their son goes to school or where they got a lot of votes, and voters observe that, then we think it's quite likely that voters will punish politicians for this. And there could be multiple reasons why this is the case. Empirically, we do observe that voters oftentimes do this. So both village development councils and voters say that they go and report politicians that are engaging in kind of blatant political their expenditure. But voters may also have kind of instrumental reasons for this, right? That spending a lot of money on your political supporter instead of what's programmatically good for your community, it could you in the long run, because it's not an effective use of your budget. So what does this lead us is, we think the effects of transparency then, if we go and,
So do you distinguish between voters that are the recipients of the allocation and voters that are not recipients of the allocation in terms of thinking about like how voters would respond to the
So we think,
distribution?
basically the assumption we're making is that you know what's going on in your village. I mean, as I showed you before, that's not universally true, but presumably if there's a big project going on in your village, at least a large number of people are going to learn about that project. So we think what we're primarily doing in this particular project is informing people that didn't benefit from the project what the politician did. And so what we're picking up is that is helping those voters sanction the politician for ineffective spending. Yeah.
Sorry, just to be sure I understand. So, but it's possible that the politician could be doing the right thing for his community, but then there's still losers from that, right?
Right.
And then those losers could still try to punish.
Yes.
But the politician was doing what they were supposed to be doing in a sense, right?
Oh, so you're saying so a politician could spend effectively on their own community, and someone else could still.
There's still going to be
Punish them.
losers, right?
Right.
Because that's the heart of these distributional issues, that even
They